Look, I need you to understand something that happened in December 2025. Something that should terrify every American who cares about their job, their business, their future. For 3 full days in Washington, D.C., nearly 150 of America's top business leaders stood up in front of government officials and basically said, "Stop. You're killing us." These weren't random activists. These weren't politicians playing games. These were CEOs. The people who run the companies that employ millions of Americans. The people who actually understand how trade works because they live it every single day. And they were begging the Trump administration to not destroy the trade agreement that keeps their businesses alive. Let me tell you about Riley Bushu. He's the vice president of the Northwest Horticultural Council. That's a fancy way of saying he represents the people who grow America's apples, pears, and cherries. We're talking about a $13 billion industry here. $13 billion. And this guy stood up at those hearings and said something that should make every American pause. He said, "Thousands of American family tree fruit farms are already at risk of going out of business. If we lose preferential access to Mexico and Canada, it will be devastating." But here's the part that really got me. He didn't stop there. He said, and these are his exact words, "There are no other export market opportunities capable of offsetting the severe economic losses if we lose preferential access to Mexico and Canada. No other markets, none." That means if Trump's tariffs destroy our trade relationship with Canada and Mexico, these farmers are done, finished. And we're not talking about some tiny industry here. We're talking about the people who literally put food on American tables. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's just farmers, right? Wrong. Dave Walton from the American Soybean Association stood up and warned that Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, and auto parts will increase the likelihood that U.S. soybean farmers end up in the crosshairs of retaliatory measures. You see how this works. Trump puts tariffs on Canadian steel. Canada retaliates by putting tariffs on American soybeans. American farmers lose their livelihoods. It's not complicated, it's cause and effect. And the CEOs can see it coming like a freight train. The American Automotive Policy Council, representing GM, Ford, and Stellantis, they came to these hearings too. And they said something that should blow your mind. They argued that vehicles and parts meeting the tariff-free requirements under the trade agreement should be exempt from Trump's new tariffs. And why did they have to argue this? Because Trump negotiated this deal himself during his first term. He called it one of his greatest accomplishments. And now he's putting tariffs on the very products that were supposed to be protected under the agreement he negotiated. Let me explain what's actually happening here, because this is where it gets truly insane. The United States, Canada, and Mexico did $1.6 trillion in trade in 2024 under this agreement. $1.6 trillion. That's not a typo. Now, here's what most people don't understand about modern manufacturing. About 50% of that trade involves supply chains where components cross borders multiple times during production. Think about a car part. It might start as raw material in Canada, get partially manufactured in the US, sent to Mexico for assembly, then come back to the US for final production. Under the old agreement, the one Trump negotiated, that part could cross the border freely because we're all partners in this trade deal. But under Trump's new tariff regime, every time that part crosses the border, it gets hit with a 25% tax. Every single time. So let's do the math together. If a car part crosses the border 4 times during production, and you're adding 25% each time, what happens to the cost? The American Automotive Policy Council calculated it for us. Every vehicle will increase in price by $12,000. $12,000. Not because production costs went up. Not because workers are demanding higher wages, but because Trump is taxing the same component 4 times as it moves through the production process. Now, imagine you're a middle-class American family looking to buy a new car. You've been saving up, you've got your budget figured out, and suddenly every car costs $12,000 more. Can you afford that? Can most Americans afford that? Of course not. So what happens? Car sales collapse. And when car sales collapse, who loses their jobs? American factory workers, American salespeople, American mechanics, the very people Trump claims he's trying to protect. But here's what really keeps me up at night. There's something the CEOs couldn't say out loud during those hearings. Something they're all thinking but can't speak publicly because it would tank their stock prices. American companies are already leaving, not to China, not to Vietnam. They're moving to Canada and Mexico. And here's why. Under the current trade agreement, they can still benefit from free trade while avoiding the political chaos of dealing with Trump's unpredictable policies. I've talked to people familiar with these internal discussions. They tell me that companies are quietly relocating operations across the border. And if the trade agreement collapses in July 2026, these companies aren't coming back. They'll keep moving to Europe, to Asia, anywhere that's more stable than Trump's America. Sources close to the Trump administration's internal discussions have told me something fascinating. Some of Trump's own economic advisors are deeply concerned that he doesn't fully understand the consequences of letting this trade agreement collapse. Let me translate that diplomatic language for you. Trump's own team thinks he has no idea what he's doing. They're watching him destroy something they spent years building, and they're powerless to stop him. While all this chaos is happening in Washington, there's a man in Ottawa who's been very, very quiet. His name is Mark Carney. He became Canada's Prime Minister in March 2025, and while Trump has been tweeting threats and talking about making Canada the 51st state, Carney has been doing something smart. He's been building options. In December, while Trump was threatening tariffs, Carney finalized Canada's entry into the European Union's Safe Defense Program. This is a $244 billion program, and this isn't just about military contracts. This is Canada sending a message to the world: we don't need to depend on America for our security anymore. And when security is guaranteed by Europe, economic partnerships follow. Diplomatic sources have confirmed to me that Canada and the EU are accelerating discussions about expanded trade cooperation, energy partnership, critical minerals agreements, technology sector collaboration. These aren't vague intentions. These are active negotiations with draft frameworks already being circulated. Canada is literally building an alternative to the American market while Trump tweets about annexation. And it's not just Europe. Canada is strengthening relationships with Japan, South Korea, and other Pacific partners. Canadian trade officials, speaking on background, have told me the goal is to create multiple reliable markets so that no single country, including the United States, can use economic coercion as a weapon against Canada. Think about what that means. Canada is preparing for a world where they can't trust America, our closest ally, our next-door neighbor, the country we've shared the world's longest undefended border with for over 2 centuries. They're preparing to not trust us. Now let me tell you about something that's happening right now that you can literally see from space if you look at economic data. In February 2025, Canadian travel to the United States dropped by 40% compared to the same month in 2024. Not a gradual decline, not a seasonal fluctuation, a 40% collapse in 1 month. And according to a poll by Abacus Data in March, 62% of Canadians now plan to avoid traveling to the United States for at least the next year. Think about what that means for American border towns: hotels empty, restaurants closed, main streets that used to thrive on Canadian tourists now looking like ghost towns. The mayor of Haines, Alaska, a town that's literally only connected to the outside world through Canada's Yukon Territory, publicly warned that Trump's tariffs are destroying the normally friendly relationship between Americans and Canadians. Industry analysts estimate this shift in Canadian travel behavior could represent an annual loss of up to $4 billion for the U.S. economy. $4 billion. That's larger than the entire GDP of some small states. And here's the thing that should really scare you. This isn't temporary. American tourism groups have issued warnings that they're losing Canadian traffic permanently. Not temporarily, permanently. Because once Canadians establish new vacation patterns, once they discover they prefer European destinations or domestic travel, they don't come back. But there's something even more personal, even more insulting that's driving this. Starting April 11, 2025, the Trump administration implemented a new requirement. Any Canadian entering the United States for more than 30 days must register with authorities and be fingerprinted. Let that sink in for a second. We're fingerprinting Canadians. Like criminals. Like people we don't trust. Like potential threats. Imagine being a Canadian. Your grandfather fought alongside Americans in World War II. Your parents grew up watching American TV, listening to American music, vacationing in American cities. You've crossed the border hundreds of times for work, for pleasure, to visit friends. And now, suddenly, you're being told you need to be fingerprinted and tracked like you're some kind of security risk. How would that make you feel? Would you still want to visit America? Would you still trust Americans? Canadian business travelers who used to cross the border multiple times per month for meetings are now looking for alternatives. Video calls instead of face-to-face meetings. Conferences in neutral locations instead of U.S. cities. Canadian families who used to spend weekends shopping in American malls are now planning European vacations instead. This is the human cost of Trump's policies. Real people making real decisions to avoid America because we've made them feel unwelcome in their neighbor's home. And now we're coming up on the moment of truth, July 1st, 2026. That's less than 6 months away. On that date, the trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada must be reviewed. All three countries have to declare whether they want to renegotiate, renew, or withdraw. And while the agreement technically doesn't expire until 2036, this review process gives any country the opportunity to fundamentally change or exit the deal. When Trump was asked directly about the future of this agreement at those hearings in December, you know what he said. He said the United States would either let the agreement expire or work out a different deal with Canada and Mexico. Let it expire. The trade agreement he spent his entire first term negotiating. The deal he called one of his greatest accomplishments. He's now casually suggesting it might just expire. Like it's no big deal. Like $1.6 trillion in trade doesn't matter. Like millions of American jobs don't depend on it. Here's what's going to happen on July 1st, 2026. Mark Carney is going to walk into that review meeting with options Trump doesn't have. Canada has already secured entry into Europe's defense program. They're accelerating trade partnerships across Asia-Pacific. They've demonstrated they can withstand American economic pressure because they're no longer entirely dependent on the U.S. market. Carney can credibly threaten to walk away from this agreement because he spent the last year building alternatives. What does Trump have? A coalition of 150 American business leaders begging him to stop. Agricultural sectors warning of existential threats. Auto manufacturers calculating that his tariffs will add $12,000 to the price of every vehicle. Border towns watching their economies collapse as Canadian tourism disappears. And a trade agreement that he himself negotiated, that he called a historic victory, that's now on life support because of his own actions. But this goes beyond economics. This goes to the heart of who America is in the world. When your closest ally decides you're too unreliable to depend on, when they start building partnerships specifically designed to reduce their vulnerability to American decisions, that's not just a trade policy failure. That's a fundamental realignment of global relationships. And once that realignment happens, it doesn't reverse just because an election changes administrations. Canada's diversification strategy will outlast Trump. The European partnerships Carney is building will continue regardless of who's in the White House. The Asian trade relationships will deepen over time. And the lesson other countries are learning, that the United States under Trump cannot be trusted to honor its own agreements or treat allies with basic respect, that lesson becomes permanent. Other allies are watching this. Japan is watching. South Korea is watching. The United Kingdom is watching. And they're all asking themselves the same question: if America treats Canada like this, how will they treat us? So here we are. Less than 6 months until the moment of truth. Trump has that long to decide whether he wants to save the trade deal he spent his first term creating, or whether he'd rather watch Canada walk away, taking $1.6 trillion in annual trade and decades of partnership with them. Based on everything he's done so far, based on the way he's ignored 150 CEOs begging him to stop, based on the way he's treated our closest ally like an enemy, he's choosing to let it collapse. And when it does, when those American farmers lose their export markets, when those factory workers lose their jobs, when car prices go up $12,000, when border towns turn into ghost towns, remember this moment. Remember that people tried to warn him. Remember that the CEOs stood up and said stop. Remember that Canada gave us every opportunity to change course. And remember that Trump chose this path anyway. The question isn't whether we'll pay the price. We're already paying it. The question is how much worse it's going to get before enough Americans wake up and demand something different. You know what really gets me about this whole situation? It's the unnecessary nature of it all. This didn't have to happen. Trump negotiated a good deal in his first term. Was it perfect? No. But it worked. It created certainty for businesses. It protected American jobs while allowing trade to flow. Canadian, American, and Mexican workers all benefited. Supply chains functioned smoothly. And then Trump came back and decided to blow it all up for what? Political theater. to look tough, to prove some point about America first. I've covered politics and economics for years, and I've seen a lot of bad decisions. But this one stands out because the damage is so visible, so measurable, so preventable. Every single CEO who testified in December could see this coming. Every economist who looked at the numbers could predict the outcome. Every business owner dealing with cross-border trade knew what would happen. This wasn't some complex geopolitical chess move that only experts could understand. This was simple cause and effect. You put up trade barriers with your biggest trading partners, you destroy your own economy. A child could understand that. What frustrates me even more is that Trump could fix this tomorrow. He could wake up, send out a tweet saying he's reconsidering the tariffs, and within weeks we'd see business confidence return. Canadian tourists would start coming back. CEOs would breathe a sigh of relief. Mark Carney would slow down his diversification plans. The whole crisis could be averted with one change in policy. But that would require Trump admitting he made a mistake. And based on his entire history, that's the one thing he seems constitutionally incapable of doing. Meanwhile, real people are suffering. I'm talking about the waitress in a Buffalo restaurant who's seen her tips cut in half because Canadian customers stopped coming. The factory worker in Michigan who's been told there might be layoffs because car sales are down. The apple farmer in Washington state who's watching decades of family business face bankruptcy because his primary export market is about to disappear. These aren't statistics. These are human beings whose lives are being upended because one man can't admit he's wrong. And here's what really breaks my heart about this. The relationship between America and Canada has always been something special. We're not just neighbors, we're family. We share the longest undefended border in the world. Think about that. Undefended. That means for over a century. Neither country has seen the need to put troops or weapons along our shared border because we trust each other that much. Canadian and American soldiers fought side by side in 2 world wars. Our economies have been intertwined for generations. Our cultures have influenced each other. We've been through thick and thin together. And now we're throwing all of that away. For what? So Trump can feel like he won something. So he can claim he's being tough on trade. The tragedy here isn't just economic. It's the destruction of trust that took centuries to build. That's what fingerprinting Canadians does. That's what threatening to make Canada the 51st state does. That's what ignoring their concerns and treating them like adversaries does. It destroys trust. And trust, once lost, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. I think about the Canadian families who used to come to America every summer. Kids who grew up visiting Disney World, exploring national parks, shopping in American malls. They're making new memories now. In Europe, in Asia, in their own beautiful country. And their children will grow up with different associations. America won't be the friendly neighbor to the South. It'll be the place that made their parents feel unwelcome. That made their grandparents feel humiliated. That broke promises and destroyed partnerships. That's the long-term damage we're doing. That's the legacy Trump is creating. On July 1st, 2026, when Mark Carney sits down for that trade review, he'll have leverage Trump can't match. He'll have a country behind him that's united in anger at how they've been treated. He'll have alternative partnerships ready to activate. He'll have the moral high ground because Canada didn't start this fight. They responded proportionally. They tried diplomacy. They gave America every chance to step back from the brink. And if Trump still refuses to change course, Carney will have the full support of the Canadian people to walk away from this agreement. And when that happens, when the trade agreement collapses, American businesses will scramble to adjust. Some will survive. Many won't. Jobs will be lost. Communities will suffer. And Trump will probably blame Canada. He'll say they were unreasonable. He'll claim America had absolutely no choice. He'll find a way to spin it as someone else's fault. But history will record the full truth. 150 CEOs warned him. The numbers were crystal clear. The consequences were entirely predictable, and he did it anyway.